Hello, Antonio.
Hello.
Hi, you all right?
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me, Antonio?
You're very low, unless it's just my speaker that's low.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
I can now. Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. Just to let you know, you're on with myself, Ray, and my co-host Patrick.
Hey, great to talk to you, Antonio.
Nice to meet you guys.
Brilliant. We'll jump straight in. Let's start with obviously you're fresh off your win over the weekend, and I saw some of your tweets, and you were a little bit critical of yourself. How did you feel your fight went over the weekend?
Well, I still feel the same way. I'm still disappointed. I didn't. I don't know. I didn't like my performance after I just kind of walked out of the cage and realized that I could have done a lot more, and I didn't do it. And I don't think I certainly didn't give the fans what they wanted. And I'm always, I'm my own worst critic. There's nothing that anybody can say that I haven't said about myself already. So.
I'll be honest with you. I think you're being a little bit harsh on yourself. Obviously, when you're fighting in a promotion like UFC, you're not going to be having any easy fights. And I just think, I think you are being a bit critical of yourself. But before we talk about Rodrigo Dam, let's talk about your fight before, because I think it's fair to say your performance before against Daniel Pineda was certainly I know it certainly stood out to me, and hopefully you'll feel a bit more positive about this. How did you feel about your fight against Daniel Pineda?
Well, again, like you said, that was about as good as it could have gotten. I think, being in Calgary in Canada in front of all my friends, and that was a great moment. I felt that I finally got to show Canada and what I was capable of as a fighter, and I really wanted to keep that kind of momentum going. And I think, I think the reason why I'm so critical of myself is because I went from that performance to another performance where I didn't feel I put out enough, and I certainly didn't, maybe do enough to entertain people, and I'm just disappointed in that regard.
Yeah, I think you're being a little bit too critical of yourself. I mean, Rodrigo Dam's been around for a long time, and he's fought all over the world, and even going into the fight with Daniel Pineda, he'd been on quite a good little run in the UFC, and I think it's probably fair to say a lot more people on the bigger stage knew who he was than who you was. So it was certainly a great way to come out and get your name out there.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, again, it's I got an opportunity to fight in Canada again. I think based on that performance, they allowed me to fight in Montreal, and I wanted to deliver a better performance. And don't get me wrong, again, like you said, I respect Rodrigo. I always have. I've watched him from his beginning as well, and I know how tough he is. And there's a lot of things I needed to be careful with. I'm not taking anything away from him either as a tough opponent. For me, there's a lot of openings that I saw even during the fight that for whatever reason I didn't react, and that's the kind of stuff that upsets me. For my own personal thing, it's just I saw things happen and sometimes I didn't react, and I have the answer sometimes and it just didn't come out, and that's why I kind of felt a little flat, I guess.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, obviously looking at you now, you're obviously on a 2-fight win streak. You've won your last 2 fights. So what happens for you next? I know it's obviously you're only literally a few days off of your fight, but how long do you rest for? When do you get back into training, and when do you look to get back into fighting again?
Well, the UFC, I mean, every fighter's suspended at least for 14 days, so the UFC usually gives us a couple of weeks before they decide to say anything, or if they say anything at all. I don't know that I'll be fighting until next year, because, the roster is incredibly packed, especially the featherweights right now. So they'd have to find some space for me, and, they really got to see where I fit. I don't know that they'll, based on this last performance, no one spoke with me after my last fight. They did speak with me right away, so obviously, I'd done something right. This one they didn't, so which means that I don't think they were too happy with it. So I don't know what's going to happen from here.
Okay. We'll move away from this subject a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about you and your background, and also about the featherweight division. So I just wanted to know how you felt when, I know this is a little bit old now, but how you felt when you heard that the UFC was going to finally pick up with the featherweight and bantamweight division, and did you kind of think this to yourself then, right, I can work towards getting into the UFC?
No, I actually thought I was done. I wasn't sure that I'd ever make it there, actually. I obviously the merger from the WEC to the UFC, that happened and it got me excited, but I was still fighting on the smaller circuits, and I didn't realize how close I was to making it to the UFC, until I actually signed with them. I was fighting on smaller circuits out here in Canada and just trying to fight the toughest guys that I could find outside of the UFC, really. And just so happens 3 fights in, I had a contract the next day. So
talking obviously pre-UFC, like you say, you'd fought on some of your local shows, but you've been over and fought in Japan as well, and you fought some of the bigger names in Japan, and not only fought some of them, but beat some of them. Have you got a favourite fight pre-UFC?
Yeah, my Rumina Sato fight. That Rumina Sato was one of those guys that he was one of the guys who made me want to go to Japan and compete out there. When I first started, competing in mixed martial arts, I knew the division existed there, and I knew all the best guys were there, and I just loved his fighting style. He was a risky fighter who's, pulling off some incredible feats, at the time, especially. Even to this day, still think his 6-second flying armbar was one of the best things I've ever, one of the most incredible submissions I've seen. He was just that guy. Charismatic, great technique, flashy, fun to watch, and I was a huge fan, and I always wanted to go to Japan and fight because of guys like him, guys like Kao Uno, guys like Hayato Sakurai, and eventually I ended up in Japan, and I ended up not only obviously fighting Romina and I actually won that fight. I also got chances to train with Kao Uno and stay with Hayato Sakurai at his house and train with his guys. So I got to meet and train with a lot of these guys that were my heroes.
Obviously the names you mentioned there are some fantastic names. What was it like getting to meet with these people and train with them? If you looked up to them.
It's funny because I was one of them. It was before I used to look at them in awe, and when they came over to me, they showed me that same kind of respect as if I was a part of the group. They didn't, it wasn't like they're belittling anybody. They were kind of bowing to me as well and giving me my respect for the work that I've put in, and that for me was, I respected that big time, and we kind of became friends after that, really, and it's just a mutual respect that we've put all this time into our craft, and it was a good feeling every time I go to the events in Japan and they'd all be there, and just to be amongst them and a part of the group.
What was it like fighting in Japan as well? Because I think the Japanese fans have got a very, very good reputation. What was it like fighting in front of those fans?
I was spoiled for sure. It's one of those things where they do appreciate the technical fighter, so I didn't always have to go out there swing for the fences. I could be my technical self, which I like to pride myself on that. I am a martial artist in my heart. That's how I feel, and when I fight, I don't fight to go out swinging just randomly. For me, it's the technique, and it's what I show my students, and what I do in the cage is usually what I try to bring across to them in my teachings. And I think that's part of what being a martial artist is about, and I'm trying to bring that to the mixed martial arts still, even though it's kind of been lost over the years. So the Japanese fans always appreciated those little details of my game, which I always thought was incredible. When I'd finish a fight, they'd come up to me and remind me of something that I did that was so minuscule that, your average fan would never have seen it before, but they obviously caught on to it because either A, they practice themselves or very knowledgeable about martial arts in general, that they know where that comes from or what I was actually trying to do.
I wanted to ask you a little bit as well. Obviously, looking over some of your fights in Japan, and you in 2007 you fought against Hatsu Hiyoki, who's obviously a very established fighter now in the UFC, and you not only did you fight him, but you beat him. So how did that fight come about, and what was it like fighting Hiyoki?
I had just lost the Shudo World title to Lion Takeshi, who I'd beaten previously, and during that fight I actually blew my knee, so that for me was like a comeback fight. I'd gone through rehabilitation and basically decided that I was going to move to Japan at that point because I wanted to just go back and fight and prove that I could still be competitive. And just so happens Yuki was on a run himself, and he had beaten some really tough guys, and I think at the time Shudo was looking to put him in as a title contender, and they matched me up with him, and he was my comeback fight, and I certainly was not expected to win that fight, and I had a rough start in the beginning, but I kind of picked it up, and I think I squeaked out that fight and managed to win, and it was certainly probably one of my biggest wins.
I mean, obviously, now that the UFC is kind of going global a bit more and it is doing events overseas, would you like to be on one of the future cards in Japan with the UFC, with going on with your record and your history of Japan?
Sure. I mean, if it was offered to me, I'd absolutely go over there. I still have friends there, and for me, it'd actually be not a difficult trip. For some fighters, it would be a very difficult trip with the time differences and the language barrier and the culture shock. For me, it wouldn't. It'd just be like me going back home again, because I lived there for 2 years. So it would be much easier for me as opposed to other foreign fighters that had never been there before. So I actually would relish it and love it, and I know for sure I would have fans in the stands to cheer me.
I know Patrick's eager to jump in, but before I pass you over to Patrick, I just want to ask you one last thing. I want to ask you about your start in MMA. I mean, you started fighting in 2002, going on your pro record. Can you tell me what made you want to get into mixed martial arts? Because it wasn't very established at the point that you got into it.
No, I mean, I was just a fan of the early UFCs. I'd always been a fan of martial arts in general. I mean, just, whether it was movies, Bruce Lee, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Chuck Norris, just like any other kid, I just enjoyed watching that. I enjoyed mimicking it as a child, but it was, it had been in the back of my head to try martial arts. I just never did. I was playing soccer or football at the time, so that's what I preferred to do. I lived in Portugal, and I actually was able to make it to one of the top teams in the country in Portugal as a goalkeeper, and I decided that that's kind of the sport that I wanted to do. It just so happens I ended up back in Canada to finish school, and I met my friend Justin Bruckman, who's my corner man to this day. He invited me to his gym, and I always thought about it, and I decided to try it one day, and next thing you know, I'm on the mats, and I thought, wow, you know what? I think this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I just couldn't explain it, and I just continued to train, do a lot of jiu-jitsu tournaments. I did a lot of judo tournaments, a lot of pankration, and eventually, I did well in that, and a professional fight came up, and I thought, you know what, let's bring it to the next level, and let's see what I can do, and that's kind of how it started. It wasn't with the intention of, doing anything else other than just testing what I had learned, and just so happens once I finished that first fight, I just loved it so much. I wanted to do it again, and I had another good result, and I just kept doing it, and it just turned into what it is.
One last question before I pass you over. You've obviously talked about football or soccer there. What team was it in Portugal that you were playing for?
I was actually called up. I played for a regional team called Sport Viseu Benfica. In the beginning, it was a third affiliate of Benfica in my hometown. But then I eventually was called up to Sporting Lisbon.
Wow. So they're obviously one of the bigger clubs, aren't they, in Portugal?
Yeah. So, they're usually consistently in the top 3 teams. And in their youth program at the time was probably the best in the country. So, again, I started it because I was a Canadian kid, even though I'm of Portuguese descent, and I was always told I couldn't play soccer. You're Canadian, there's no way you can play the sport. And, a couple of years later, I was on the biggest team in the country, so.
Brilliant. Well, I know Patrick's eager to jump in, so I'll let Patrick take over. You good to go, Patrick?
Yeah, I'm all set, and thanks again for coming on, Antonio. That's a very great story to hear about your football background.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I see you're also a black belt in Shotokan Karate and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Is that correct?
I'm actually not a black belt in Shotokan. I don't know where that came from, but the only thing is that I actually trained with my instructor was the 6-time champion in Canada for Shotokan, and he was a world champion at some point as well. And so I trained with a lot of the national team members. But I only used to spar with them Shotokan style. So I think that's where the mistake comes from, is that because I've trained with the highest level Shotokan practitioners in the country, people assumed I was a black belt. But in fact, I was just training in it as I was doing my mixed martial arts training. And I just took a lot of the techniques from Shotokan and implemented them into my mixed martial arts game.
Okay. Well, I can certainly see how people would assume you're a black belt. I mean, watching your striking in a lot of your fights. For example, the Rodrigo Dam fight this past Saturday, you were chopping down his lead leg with some sick leg kicks. Was that a strategy going in?
I think, you know what, it's one of those things that if I see the opening, I'll take it, and it was just there. So I decided that, you know, that was the technique that was there a lot, and I made sure I tried to punish him with it as much as possible.
I see. Well, you got to take what they give you. No, I thought in that fight you had showed good striking defense. You landed some of the hardest punches and kicks of that fight, in my opinion. There's a really great scramble in the second round where you prevented Rodrigo from taking your back, and you kept the fight standing. Were you confident that you had the victory when it went to the judges' scorecards?
I was confident that I would win. I always felt that I was ahead in the fight. When I heard the split, even that, I thought, you know what, I still think it's going to be a split for me. I could, you know, from what I've read or talked to people, like, I mean, there's a larger percentage of people think I won that fight, and there's a smaller percentage that thinks that he may have won it. It was a close fight. I just think, in my opinion, you know, not to take anything away from Rodrigo, he obviously was upset after the fight, and I did talk to him, and I told him that I'd fight him again if he wanted the opportunity. I always felt that I'd landed the better strikes, and I controlled the fight a lot more than he did.
Yeah, well, I know I'd certainly be inclined to agree with that. I'd be the larger percentage that could see it going your way. I mean, the damage on his leg was evident that, I mean, you were inflicting the majority of the damage, and that's what a fight is, essentially. You know, where control and all that nuance pretty much comes second to that. Which kind of leads into my another point I wanted to talk to you about. There was a CompuStrike stat somewhere in the third round that showed Dam leading in head strikes, like around 20-40 or 6, which I found kind of debatable. Now, as a fighter, do you feel the fight metric or CompuStrike stats are accurate, or for that matter, do you think they're important?
Hello?
Hello?
Are you still there, Patrick?
You cut out there for a bit.
Yeah, you cut out, Patrick. Do you want to rephrase the end of that question, Patrick?
Yeah, terribly sorry. Just as a fighter, do you feel the fight metric or CompuStrike stats are accurate or important?
Well, I mean, it depends how you look at it. Like, you know, you could throw lots of punches. It doesn't mean they're landing. You know, there's one thing, like, that's the one thing I do like about boxing is that they don't always count the offense. It's always defense. If you're throwing punches and I'm slipping and moving away from the shots and they're not landing, but I'm landing the better shots, then technically I'm still winning the fight. So, I mean, as much as he can throw, it doesn't necessarily mean he's being very effective with them. And so that, I think that's the main difference is whether or not, you know, I can count, I threw probably just as many kicks as he did punches.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I wanted to go back a little bit to your win streak that got you into the UFC. I was watching the fight between yourself and Juan Durantes. It was a quick bout. There was a little bit of a feeling out process. Then about 2 minutes in, you got a knockout with this, it was this wicked right hand that came after an uppercut that rocked him. What was your mindset like going into that fight?
I was actually very respectful of him because I know he had gone the distance with Bibiano Fernandez, so I knew he was a tough guy. He actually hit me with some awkward shots in the beginning that actually kind of woke me up, and then, you know, sometimes in fights that, you know, you either switch it on or you don't, and I wish I would have had that kind of switch in the Rodrigo Dam fight, because there are fights that I all of a sudden just switch on, and all of a sudden I can see things happening, and next thing you know, the outcome can sometimes be that, and that's always been my main problem, is that sometimes I'm not consistent in that regard, like I don't turn on or something. But when I do, I know I can do some pretty exciting things and some pretty incredible things in the cage. That happened to be one of those fights where all of a sudden I just woke up and I felt everything I was going to throw was just setting him up for the knockout.
Yeah. Well, and you certainly do put on great performances, you know, whether it's through the knockout or a good technical showing like you had this past weekend. So now you're 2-1 in the UFC. The featherweight division is stacked. I know you said you hadn't really spoken to anybody just yet. I mean, of course, just a couple days out from your fight. But is there any particular opponent you like to face in your next match?
Well, I don't know really. I mean, as far as it'll have to be up to the UFC. It's got to certainly be someone that's also on a winning streak like me. I don't really pick opponents, and there's a lot of exciting fighters that I think I'd match up well with, and I know that's Joe Silva's and Sean Shelby's job, and they're good at it, and I'm sure they're going to match me up to try to make an exciting fight. Although I'm pretty sure they thought this might be an exciting fight, and it wasn't the most exciting fight. So,
well, hey, that's just kind of depends on who you talk to. I mean, that's relative. I certainly thought it was an exciting fight. Now, one last question for you before we let you go. At UFC 149, you walked out to Bret the Hitman Hart's theme music. Were you a big wrestling fan growing up?
Yeah, I was. Especially, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s. That was kind of where Bret was, you know, I guess he was the man at the time in the WWF, when they were the WWF, not the WWE. And at the time I was actually living in Portugal, so for me, like, he used to carry the Canadian flag, and he was a big fan favorite, and I always liked what he kind of represented as a character in professional wrestling at the time, where he was being, besides the whole Canada versus US thing, that I wasn't a big fan of that era, but I was certainly a big fan of how he was a very honorable champion, and the way he carried himself, and that sort of was something that for me is kind of how I view martial arts as well. So when I found out I was fighting in Calgary, that he was actually the first guy I thought of to contact, and I wanted to talk to and let him know, you know, that I really appreciated what he did and how many years he put into his craft, and how much his character meant to me as a child growing up. And I did get a chance to do that. Originally when I contacted him, he didn't respond right away, because I'm pretty sure he was trying to figure out who the hell is this guy. It just so happens his wife actually went online and did some checking up on me, and she actually thought that maybe he should take the time and meet me, and he eventually did the same and checked up on me, and he made sure that he came to see me, and the idea was actually to come to the cage with him that night, but I guess Nick Ring ended up getting Bret instead, because he's a Calgary guy, so it just happens the UFC decided that, you know, he should go with him instead, but I actually came up with this theme song, and so I got the crowd pretty pumped for that. And when I went out and had the performance I did, and I walked out, I actually saw him backstage later, and he was pretty happy, and we actually ended up having beers, and, you know, 2 days later in this beautiful place called Banff in Calgary, and just hanging out with Bret the Hitman Hart. So it was a pretty cool experience where we were just exchanging stories, and yeah, he's a great man.
Oh, that's an awesome story. Yeah, that must have been fantastic. I mean, heck, everybody was a big fan of the Hitman and the WWF, WWE, and the 89. Yeah, that must have been great.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, we don't want to take up too much of your time, Antonio. We really appreciate you coming on. Go ahead and feel free to shout out any sponsors or anybody you'd like to shout out, and let the people know how they can follow you on Facebook or Twitter.
Yeah, I haven't even thought about that. Actually, I'm on Twitter. I'm Antonio Pato MMA, or on Twitter. You can probably find me on Facebook too. I'm on Facebook. Sponsors, Rivalist, Under Armour, Fear the Fighter, Sewer Technologies Incorporated, my manager Joey Benoit, all the boys from Brooklyn Martial Arts, my striking coach Joseph Valtellini, my wrestling coach Mike Francis, Grant's MMA, Sean Pearson from Grant's MMA as well. He's always been there for me. I got lots of people that just, are always helping me, and I appreciate all their help, and I can't remember everyone right now, so I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, hey, thanks again for your time, Antonio. I really appreciate it, and good luck moving forward.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Antonio.
Thank you.